Okay, welcome everyone to the college essay writing process, which is a quick little webinar by College Com. And I am Roxana, and I am joined here with Jenny. And we are going to take you through sort of the overview of what the writing process looks like for college application writing. It's very different than, say, writing an essay on the Odyssey or a history paper on the Civil War. So we just wanted to give families, parents, and students the opportunity to just get a good overview of what the writing process looks like. All right, so the goals for today are pretty simple. We want students to understand the writing process from start to finish. We really want to emphasize that this type of writing takes a lot of work. It takes a great deal of reflection and just time to develop a strong essay, which is why we spend a lot of the summer helping students develop their essays and the different writing components for the schools. We'll talk a little bit about the different type of writing and how it's different to write a personal statement than you see insight questions, which are also different than supplemental essays. Although in some cases, students are really reusing a lot of content. And then the end, we'll talk a little bit about what is it supposed to look like at the end, right? And the biggest thing is that a strong essay is one that tells the reader something new and compelling about a student that cannot be found somewhere else in your application. The writing should not be a rehash of what's on your activities resume, right? And I also wanted to take this time just to, with all of our students, we kind of start out with our expectations and our rules. And there's kind of three basic rules that we have. And one of them is that you have complete ownership over your essay. No one else can write it for you. We are here to guide you and to ask questions, but ultimately your essay belongs to you. So if we end up going down a path of writing about something that you just really don't feel like you want to write about, you got to stand up and say, no thanks, and tell us. We are idea generating people and helping you trying to make and connect the dots so that your essay really is a compelling piece that really tells the college a lot about you and who you are and what you value. But if we're starting down a path and you're not feeling that, it is your job to stop us. This is your essay. So I want to make sure that students understand they own their essay. Rule number 2 is that this is a process. You're going to do lots and lots and lots of drafts. And that's, way after we're going to talk about brainstorming and developing content. I mean, we don't even get to drafts till, quite a bit later. And that you're probably going to do at least 4 solid drafts and then a final edit with every piece of writing that you're doing. I'm pretty realistic, a bit of a straight shooter. It's going to be painful at times. I'm not going to lie, right? And what you turn in at the end of this process is not going to be perfect. We could go through and redo essays 50 times, and it's still never going to be a finished product. Writing is one of those things we get to a certain point and we say, this is as good as it's going to get. We feel really good about it, and we're ready. But professional writers struggle every time they sit down to write a piece. And this summer, you will experience this struggle. We sometimes are going to encourage you to write about topics that have a conflict, because that conflicts inherently tell a good story. And it could be very personal. That doesn't mean that you'll always enjoy everything that you're writing about, or that it's always going to be, hunky-dory, candy in the candy shop. But that this is a process. It's a process of you getting to know yourself through the writing, and us helping to work together. We're going to struggle together, I promise you. Jenny and I are here. We will struggle with you. And that the goal is to create an essay that expresses who you are and how you function in the world. And the last piece is that we are a reviewer and a coach. And, we're there for you to bounce ideas off of. We're there to help you generate ideas. We are not an editor. We're not going to tell you exactly what to do, and we certainly aren't going to fix it for you. We will be giving you written feedback. We will be giving you comments, and we expect that you will think a lot about that feedback. We spend a lot of time. I mean, I would say at least half an hour before you come in to talk about your draft, oftentimes more, digging through and trying to give you really thoughtful comments. But it's your job to take those comments and make changes in your essay. And we're going to talk a little bit about sort of where that happens in the process.
So the first thing that the first type of writing that we're going to kind of dive into here is the personal statement. So if I had to describe this, I would say it's an essay about your personal accomplishments or characteristics or an achievement or an experience, something compelling that's happened to you that highlights your unique attributes, right? So that's why it is a little bit different than writing a typical essay for history. First of all, it's very personal. It's about your experiences. And second of all, you're trying to tell an entertaining story or a compelling story so that the person on the other side who has never met you before, or maybe has met you, but doesn't know a ton about you, gets a better picture of who you are beyond your GPA and test scores, so that they can kind of feel out if you would fit on their campus, as some of the wonderful things that you've done, or maybe some of the hardships that you've overcome. So the personal statement is typically used for either the common application, the coalition application, or in general, schools that don't use either of those applications may use their own personal application. The personal statement is not for the UCs, and it is not for the CSUs. So the UCs and the CSU systems will never see your personal statement. The common application has 7 prompts, and you choose one, and topics include describe a struggle or a topic of your choice or a big event in your life. And the coalition has 5 different prompts that you can choose from, all kind of around the same type of topics. And while these prompts are super important, the more important thing is telling the admissions officer something interesting about you that's happened, and then we can kind of fit that to whatever prompt we think fits best. So sometimes the prompt in the beginning, we may look at them and say, okay, do any of these speak to you? But we're not necessarily so married to that prompt in the beginning of the writing process that we're going to write every little thing about that. So what we typically do is look for something unique, and we'll kind of go into brainstorming in a minute. We look at all of your application and your activities list and think about if we can find something that's something new or interesting about your character. And then we try to brainstorm on those different ideas. So that personal statement is essentially telling a story that explains you in a nutshell.
Yeah, and I would say when we get a little bit further on in talking about sort of the phases of the writing, that it's the actual question that you choose is often related to how you want to structure what you want to say versus the content. So that's just something to keep in mind.
So then in moving on, the UC insight questions are specifically for the UCs, and the other colleges that use the personal statement aren't going to necessarily see they're not going to see your UC insight questions. So those insight questions are 8 prompts, and you choose 4, and you answer them in 350 words. I should have said before, the personal statement usually reigns in around 500 to 600 words. I think the max is 650 for the common application, and for the coalition application, sometimes around 500, 550. So these are quite a bit shorter, and they are definitely a more practical and straightforward approach to these questions. I would almost go to say that these are more like interview questions. They ask you a question, and what they're looking for is for you to provide an answer to that question, and then supporting examples that show your answer to that question. So you're going to really work more specifically within that prompt, and make sure that you're answering the prompt why it's important to you, and how you've changed from this experience. And I think that's really what they're looking for in the UC Insight questions. Of course, we're going to be creative and try to draw the reader in just as we would with a personal statement, but they're just more practical and straightforward, which is nice because then we can often use them for supplemental questions and repurpose them. And typically the supplemental questions, schools can have anywhere from 1 to 3 per school, sometimes more if they're short answer. They can look at in the form of 100 to 200 words, or maybe a sentence, or maybe a word. There's all different types of supplemental questions. And this is really where colleges are looking for a specific fit, and that you've done your research, and see kind of how you fit in the social context or the academic context of their school. So when we delve into the writing process and really understand this kind of timeline, right? We are typically meeting with students 6 to 8 sessions over the summer months. Those beginning sessions, we do a lot of brainstorming. So at least 3 sessions, I would say, of brainstorming, where we're developing ideas, trying to understand your students' values, what's important to them, and really taking those ideas and then going off and doing some free writing. After we brainstorm ideas, do some of the free writing, figure out kind of what we're going to talk about, that's then when we move into the rough draft phase. So we just spend quite a bit of time in those first 2 bullets before we even get to that rough draft piece. And then after we create a draft with all of our ideas, figuring out that, we'll review for content and then review for structure. And then in late August, hopefully, we are working towards final drafts and polishing.
Yeah, I mean, the brainstorming and the free writing is really just it's helping students go through the process of figuring out, what do you want to write about? And sometimes it's a student will come in and say, I want to write about, one particular thing, and it'll work and we'll go with it. So we're not going to unnecessarily make students go through the brainstorming and free writing, but what we found is the more time that we spend on brainstorming and free writing, the less time we have to spend creating a really good rough draft. Because it's hard to take a rough draft because students are really tied to them. And so making just minor edits and comments and things like that on a rough draft, as opposed to taking the brainstorming and the free writing and building a really good outline and then having them do a rough draft. We are trying to, when they really get to like the structure of writing something and the structure of a personal statement, we want to make sure that they're getting to the ideas that they want to talk about. Because trying to flesh out those ideas through 7 drafts is kind of rough. So no matter what you're writing, we go through kind of 3 big phases. The first part is developing the content, right? Figuring out what students want to write about, what specific examples do they want to use to highlight their values. We do some exercises with students that's based off of their character traits, and we have them write two quick stories about how friendship is a really important value to them. And what we're trying to do is get them to think about the big picture things of what they want to say, but also generating examples, specific examples that support what they're trying to say about themselves. Because in the end, a college essay is a persuasive essay. Right? You're not writing it to say, here are the 7 reasons why you should admit me. But what you are trying to persuade them, you're trying to persuade them and show them and prove to them that you are the person that you want and are trying to tell them that you are. Right? Coming in and saying, I am very family oriented. I really enjoy people. I'm an extrovert. All those things are wonderful. But nobody's going to believe you unless you can show them and give them specific examples. So a lot of time in developing content is us saying, what's a specific example? And what's really interesting to note on this is a lot of times kids can't come up with them, but guess what? Parents can. So this is where we say, hey, you know what? If you say that you're a really detail-oriented person and you're having trouble coming up with an idea, why don't you go talk to your friends? Go talk to your family and see, how they view you and what are examples that they remember about you. Or if you're a generous person, a lot of times generous people aren't going around accumulating, examples of when they're being generous, right? But the people around them are able to say, hey, remember that time where, so-and-so sat down and they didn't have a lunch and you gave them half of yours, and I think also families and students get really caught up with them with examples having to be this like massive, oh my gosh, amazing moment. Some of the greatest examples are so mundane and so, just related to day-to-day life. But they really do show a lot about a student. So we've got the content piece. Once we've figured out what the content is, right, what the student's trying to say and the examples that they want to use, then we create the structure. And the structure on this sense is really about, okay, where should we start? Should we start with a story? Should we start at the end? Should we start in the middle? Do we want an anecdote? How is the best way from a structural standpoint to get across what you're trying to get across? And then amazingly enough, right, all kids think we sit in the world of polish like the entire time that we're going through this all summer. Polishing word choice, sentence structure, verbs, tense, all that stuff is at the end. And quite frankly, super easy and is really just done at the end. We are so much more concerned about the content and the structure. The polishing is really the last part of that stage.
So when we move into the brainstorming phase, when we're first starting out with this, we are really utilizing all of our tools in our toolbox here. So we're trying to determine what the strongest traits exist in your student. And it really takes a lot of reflection and thought, and it's really hard for students to figure this out. Like Roxana was saying, we're trying to find different examples and different experiences that kind of support those ideas. And we do that in a variety of ways here listed on the right. So the top little thing up here is a vision board. We might do some kind of vision board if our person is an artist or very visual. We use the essence objects exercise, which we're not going to go through the ins and outs of each of those things. We talk about the students, what do I value? If they had something, happen to them, or if there was a hurdle that a student was trying to get over, we would maybe use the feelings and needs exercise. And always a great place for us to start are the personal insight question worksheets, because it talks about leadership and community service and an academic subject that inspires you. And it really encourages students to kind of look deep into themselves of all of the wonderful things that they've done. And like Roxana said, they don't have to be these like grandiose examples. They could be something small and little nuggets of information that we kind of go off of, but we're trying to get the most down and see what that looks like.
Well, I would say on the personal insight questions, if there's anyone listening who does not have a student that's a junior right at the moment, this is a great thing. You can look it up. You see personal insight questions, Google it, you'll get it. These are really great questions because it's 8 different aspects of a kid. And if throughout high school, students are kind of looking at this and saying, oh, this is interesting. If you can answer 4, you do not have to answer 8. You don't have to have answers for 8. But if you have good, solid answers to 4 of these, like, man, you're doing a great job. And you're doing a great job in high school. And so it's kind of something to pull out a little bit earlier rather than later. And we do that sometimes with students. By the time they're juniors, we're brainstorming what could go in each question. But it's a really good tool, I think, for students to kind of understand, how are they developing potentially 4 different aspects of themselves. We're all very complicated, human beings, and we have a lot of strengths. We have some weaknesses, we have some passions and things like that. But if you can go through and say, hey, yeah, you know what? I do feel like I'm working on my leadership and that I'm creative and I've got something going on in the community, like that's a really, really, really good start.
And then I would say this is kind of what our free writing, rough drafts, content development looks like. Once we have a compelling idea or a subject, mapping out the qualities that go with this experience and free writing to see if any stories come out from this, and seeing if this is in fact a path to explore. Like Roxana said in the beginning, this is your writing. And sometimes when we think something's great, we may be like, okay, go with that and see what you can write about, or see if this pans out. And you may come back, or the student may come back and say, okay, it didn't pan out. And then we know to kind of, all right, well, let's try to go at it a different angle. And although we will fight the urge to make everything come together in this stage, we know in our hearts that this is the messy part. This is the part where we're writing, refining, developing that theme, refining the content, and going back to the drawing board a couple of times. This is the hard part of the writing, talking about what did you learn? Why is this important to you? How does it relate to a certain career that you want to do, and really pulling those examples of like creativity, humor, conflict resolution, anything that goes along with being the president of the improv club, right? These are, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, this is the hardest part for students, is to answer the why is it important? Or how did it help you grow? Or how did you change? And I think, why is this unique, right? This is the part that we kind of go over and over to make sure that this can only be your essay.
Yeah, I think that that's definitely true. I think, we call it the messy middle, right? It's where you've got like 7 different papers or Google Docs or whatever, and we're going to go through and highlight, and the student's going to go through and highlight and say, this is what I like the best. And then we're going to take that content and we're going to say, okay, do we have the best examples here? And so we just keep refining and moving, but it's messy. And you know what? It does not look like an essay, right? And the kids are like, we've been working on this for, 3 sessions. How come I don't have an essay? They really do. And it's so easy when we have all of those pieces in place.
And a lot of times things that come up in this messy middle, even if we don't use them in the actual personal statement, we use them later. We use them for a supplemental question or another, short answer question that a college may ask, or maybe we use them for the UC questions. But a lot of this information does get repurposed if it doesn't make it into the big show or the personal statement.
Yes, and I always, students are always like, this isn't good, and they want to, delete it. And I was like, don't delete anything. Because it'll be really funny, because later on in the process, when they're writing a supplement, and I'll say, what about that sentence? You had this great sentence about, how you were super spontaneous in the improv club, and how that's how you ended up meeting, I'm making this up, but ended up meeting, 2 of your best friends. Right. And they'll look at me and I say, yeah, go find that sentence. Right. Because that's what belongs in this supplement about why you want to go to this school, is because they have this amazing improv club. And what you're excited about is to meet other people who love this, spontaneity like you. So I think kids get really surprised about A, how much we remember, and B, just how everything that they're doing in this stage actually ends up being used later on. So, a lot of the things is that once you develop this content, it's going a lot of different places, or can go a lot of different places, which kind of starts to, move towards structure. Is that, there might be a really great example about a student that they decide is what they want to do for their opening, like their little anecdote, a little story about, how they helped a little girl in Girl Scouts who dropped her pottery, and they had to figure out how to help the kid who was crying, and maybe it turned into an amazing growth opportunity for the whole group. I think in that particular one of the other kids stood up and said, you can have mine. But, we figure out, is that good for the opening? Is that good for the content paragraphs to support the theme that you're trying to say about yourself? Or is that going to be a closing? Or do you split that story up into 3 pieces? so that there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. And your last end paragraph is with this student standing up and giving her pottery to another kid, and that is a symbol of the type of person that you want to be, or that you want to work with children, or whatever it may be. So we're taking all of that content and trying to figure out, does it work best in an opening? How might it be to supporting in the content paragraphs, or could it be in the closing piece? And like the bottom purple here are just some things that we're constantly telling students, that if you're telling a story, best to start at the peak of the action. Right? There are people who are reading 30 to 40 essays a day. Please help them stay engaged in your essay by starting in the middle of the action. When you're using and trying to find good examples, make sure that you're showing the reader so they can picture you and what's going on rather than telling you. And in your closing, there should be some reflection as to why is this important? Why did you choose to tell this story? And how does it relate to your future? So this is just to follow up on that. We're finding structure in the order of the essay. We want to know, does it flow? Is it engaging, right? Is it easy for the reader? Is there anything within the structure that is distracting the reader? Are you supporting the theme? Now, this does not have a thesis statement. I think students really wish that it did, because it would make this writing a lot easier. We have an unforeseen, we have a non-written out thesis statement. We actually make the kids write it out. It just doesn't end up in the word count in terms of what they're trying to say. And do we go through and we say, is everything that you're saying supporting this theme or this thesis that you have? Does it start in the action? Are you captivating the reader? Are there too many words explaining? A lot of this part, I'll start to say, okay, well, if we look at your essay, it's top heavy, right? You take a paragraph and a half to get through the beginning, and you leave 3 sentences for the end. Does that seem right? And so we're trying to figure out, right, the structure, how they're distributing the words, and does the timeline make sense? So those are some of the questions that we're asking them. Sometimes if we're not feeling like all the parts are fitting together, I'm going to stop where we are, look at them, and ask them to give me their elevator pitch of their essay. I'm an admissions officer. I'm going up in the elevator. You got 30 seconds to tell me what this essay is about. And that's how we're really testing to make sure that they're writing what they really want to be writing, and that they're using the right examples to support what they're trying to say. And of course, in some instances, what we realize at that point is they are very unsure of what they want to say, in which case, take a step back and we start going through it again.
And then for polishing and finalizing, again, this part is pretty fun. And this is where we're reviewing for word count, maybe changing some of the weak words to stronger words, eliminating sentences that that just don't make the cut anymore. We're looking at is there a strong opening, a strong ending? But most importantly, have we learned something new and unique about you? So like Roxana said, we kind of do those checks in about are we saying what we want to say, or are you saying what you want to say? And just making sure that at the end we've learned something new and compelling. But this polishing and finalizing piece is I think kind of the most fun part, because you really start to see the essay take its shape and take its form. We look through it together a lot of times, and they're like, I just need to cut 4 more words, and then being able to get it under the word counts and things like that. So the polishing and finalizing usually happens towards the beginning of fall, maybe sometimes a little bit later into fall, depending on how summer went. So this is again, hopefully the ending of your draft, the time where we say, okay, we've taken it as far as we can. It sounds great. It says all it needs to say, and we're done.
Yeah, and it's also the part to make sure, that they're feeling like it's their voice. I've had instances, I do love to have families read before the polishing stage in terms of just kind of getting the gist of what their students are writing about. But I always tell them a couple of things. One, make sure you're telling your family what you want them to read for. Because if you don't want them reading for content, don't ask them to read for content, right? If you just want them to make sure that there's no egregious spelling errors, or if you want them to look at a specific example or things like that. There have been instances, I have to say, where essays that were almost done come back with a incredible polish. I mean, like a pretty, amazing polish by the parent. But the problem is now it reads like a parent. So I honestly don't know whether to be super proud of this or not. I think Jenny feels the same way. We are masters of the voice of 17 and 18-year-olds and what's appropriate. And so there's certain words that we can tell when parents have been kind of with the essays and we're like, is that a word you would use? And the kid kind of looks at you, he's like, I don't even know what that word means. That we want to make sure as we're going through this process that their voice is coming through and that they're using the language that is their own, but that doesn't mean that that we're not giving a ton of feedback in terms of how they can make improvements. It's just that we try really hard to keep our fingers out of the essay and have them make those changes.
And I will say just one more thing on polishing and finalizing. Oftentimes at the end, a student's urge is to have like 15 people read it or have and take it to a variety of different people, and everybody has their kind of own opinion or taking on it. And I think that also muddies the water a little bit as well for the student. It's great to have somebody read it over, like Roxana said, to just make sure it's saying what it needs to say. But at this point, we just want the student to feel confident about his or her writing, to feel like he or she has put their best foot forward, and to just feel like I have accomplish this goal. And so I think it's easy as parents to want to change all of those words and do all of that, but sometimes that leads to making the student feel nervous about their work.
Yeah, I think the other thing too is that they just sometimes get feedback overload. This is a very subjective process. Anyone who reads a college essay is going to have comments. And so at a certain point, after having 2 or 3 people read it, which I think is very valuable, I think it just starts to be that subjective piece of, well, they said I should do this. And it's like, well, that's that person's opinion, and that's fine. How do you feel about it? Do you want to make those changes? And the fact is, by the time they get to this point, gosh darn, they have worked so hard. And typically, they are pretty darn proud of what they've created. And so are we. So to kind of close it out, if you have done the following things, it means that you have a really strong essay or supplement or whatever question that you're answering. If you have told the admissions committee something that cannot be found anywhere else in your application, if you have explained what you value in your life and supported that with concrete examples, and if you have made your examples so personal that it could not be anyone else's essay. There are topics that are done and redone and overdone that lots of students write about. We don't have any hard and fast rules like, no, you can't write about kicking the, final soccer goal in the championships, okay? But what's important to us is that you write about it so specifically that it could not be about anybody else on your team or any other soccer player at your school. We're going to help students try to stay away from super generic things that just have a foregone conclusion so that the reader's not really going to keep on reading because they know what happens when you kick the winning goal. But that the uniqueness, the way that a student presents their writing, the examples that they use, that is what makes a good college essay. It's not the topic itself. It's how the student brings themselves to the topic that really makes it memorable and a good reflection of who they are. So that is it. We came in like 3 minutes over. We will stop the recording so that if people have questions, we're happy to answer them. But we hope that you see this is this is the hard part, right? The essays is really hard, but that we do have a process in place, even though it is messy at times. We have a vision, and the kids do come through it in the end. But that college application writing, there's going to be some struggle. But quite frankly, if there isn't some type of struggle in terms of, then they probably aren't doing it right. So thank you for tuning in. And that is all from College Calm.